Welcome classic rock fans to one of my ranking videos, and yes, we've finally got round to it. We're going to look at the albums of Deep Purple. As always, I urge you to click like, subscribe, and do check that bell so you get notified of any future uploads. And if you enjoy these reviews, be sure to check out some of the links below this video for ways you can support the work done here at Classic Album Review. You can become a Patreon. There's a fine body of work on my Patreon at the moment, or you can simply like the Facebook page. It's all good and it's all much appreciated. Anyway, enough of this flim-flam, let's get on with the album ranking, shall we? Number 21 is The Battle Rages On from 1993. This album follows that ill-fated rainbow purple incarnation of the band, and it was an attempt to welcome Ian Gillan back into the fold. It was about reconciliation in some respects, which makes the title somewhat ironic, doesn't it? And they all knuckle down to churning out another Purple album. This has gone on record as being perhaps the unhappiest album they've ever done. Don't get me wrong, there are moments of greatness on this album, not there are moments of greatness on every Deep Purple album. For example, the panoramic Anya, comprising of what one critic has described as Blackmore's fleet-fingered flamenco. As we said, the atmosphere surrounding this album is fraught, to say the least, dramatically altering the fault line of this band. On this album, this tension doesn't spark anything wonderful. In fact, the opposite is true. It actually becomes quite destructive, derailing the creative endeavour. I think Blackmore actually quits for the last time, rather waggishly dubbing this album The Cattle Grazes On. There's these fractured relationships which in part have tortured this band for years. Of course, this is the classic Mark II lineup, but there's very little classic about this album. That being said, the opening track is excellent. It's an angry, spiky number. Blackmore's playing is superb on one man's meat, full of swagger and attitude, and A Twist in the Tail is another great one. Number 20 is Slaves and Masters from 1990. I don't think Purple fans were ever going to be particularly happy with Joe Lynn Turner sliding his way into Ian Gillan's shoes, but that's exactly what happens here as the band morph horribly into Rainbow. But in saying that, Joe Lynn Turner does do a wonderful job on this record, it has to be said. With this album, Blackmore has effectively wrestled those creative reins from Ian Gillan before, of course, he departs and goes to reform Rainbow once more. And that, in part, is what's wrong with this record. The songwriting is quite lacklustre. It lacks that wit and wordplay that Gillan brings to the fold, that wordsmithery that he's quite famous for these days. And I even think Blackmore's playing is somewhat uninvested on this one as well. And the cover is absolutely dreadful, described by Classic Rock as a Rolf Harris sketch for a particularly bad Magnum bootleg. A shout-out has to go to Roger Glover's production on this one, which absolutely sparkles with energy and vibrancy. And the standout tracks, I think, are King of Dreams, Love Conquers All, and Breakfast in Bed. Number 19 is Bananas from 2003. This is Purple's first album with Don Airey. And the dreadful title, it has to be said, is actually a reference to a much fabled EU law stating that people could only sell straight bananas. It was in all the newspapers at the time. Sounds a bit like fake news to me. But it's obviously a pun, flickering between the literal and figurative meaning of the word. I have to say, this is one of the worst album covers I've seen within that classic hard rock idiom. And it's not rescued in any way by the material on this record. In fact, this record's been described by Classic Rock as a fruitless pursuit. The string ensemble on Haunted adds an interesting voice to this record, and talking of interesting voices, Beth Hart does a wonderful, wonderful job as well. One of the finest moments on the album is Contact Lost, which is very much about the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster. Listening to this song really does give me chills. The sound does feel like a rather strained affair, bereft of ideas. In fact, one critic described the band as sleepwalking on this one. A band obviously reeling perhaps from the departure of John Lord. The standout tracks on this album are Pictures of Innocence, I Got Your Number, and Never a Word. But as we said, the music seems a little bit off on this one. It's been described by one critic as just mid-tempo boogie. It certainly lacks that monolithic sound we'd expect from a Purple album. A temporary blip, or perhaps you could even say a bit of a banana skin. Number 18 is Rapture of the Deep from 2005. We get that muscular and sturdy throb which very much defines the sound of this band and this album, in fact. This being the sophomore effort of the lineup that consisted of Gillan, Glover, Steve Morse, Ian Pace and Don Airey. And I have to say that Don Airey fills Lord's loafers admirably. One can detect renewed energy and vigour as the lineup really beds itself in for this one. And I have to admit, I love what Steve Morse brings to this band. They seem to be in a much happier, more contented place. And his technical wizardry regarding the fretboard is undeniable. Taking nothing away from Richie Blackmore, of course, whose playing is absolutely remarkable, who was an incredibly influential musician. And in terms of the sound and stage presence, he helps very much define the aura of that classic Mark II lineup. But I must admit the band seemed happier, more energised, more driven once Blackmore had departed. I mean, I saw Deep Purple with Blackmore on the Perfect Strangers tour, if you can call it that. It consisted of the Nebworth gig, and it was just wonderful to see him play with Purple. But the atmosphere is completely different with Steve Morse. And Steve Morse is all over this record. His tone and style is very much helps shape the sound of this album, as does Don Airey, of course, who appropriates the archetypal Hammond growl. Standout tracks for me are Rapture of the Deep, Girls Like That, and Clearly Quite Absurd, which is a remarkable number. Remarkable because Gillan's voice is deliberately subdued on this one, beautifully accompanying Don Airey's piano work and that wonderful muscular ascending riff from Steve Morse. Brilliant stuff. This is the first album that the band did for the Eagle label, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a great album, but like Bananas, I just feel the quality of the songwriting, it just isn't quite there. Number 17 is House of Blue Light from 1987. I must admit expectations were running pretty high after the brilliance and danger that was Perfect Strangers, and this album certainly rides that record's coattails, but just doesn't quite live up to it. Despite some wonderful playing from the band, it does come across as a tad formulaic and generic, and the ogre of band politics rears its ugly head once more, with the relationship between Gillan and Blackmore breaking down once more. And as one critic has pointed out, the band tried to appropriate and harness those horrible 1980s affectations on this one to try and glam up the band's sound. That's certainly apparent on tracks like Bad Attitude and Unwritten Law, with its reverb-drenched guitar. And that's not to say they're not great numbers, though. The intro to Mad Dog is absolutely fantastic as well. I love the Eastern flavour of Spanish Archer, and Black and White is another interesting number. I love the interplay between John Lord and Richie Blackmore on that one. It's overall a decent album, I have to say. Number 16 is Infinite from 2007. This is one of those later Purple releases where they beautifully emulate and mine that archetypal Purple sound. There's some wonderful tones explored on this one, reminiscent of their finest works. Nick Cave famously said that he wasn't interested in nostalgia, but he was interested in memory. And some of these later releases have these reminiscences of classic Purple without becoming maudlin and self-mythologizing. And a perfect example of that is the way this band looks to constantly push the envelope and explore different nuances and shades with these songs. Perfect example would be Time for Bedlam. It kicks things off in real style with its spacey spoken intro, and Don Airey is absolutely wonderful on this one. As we said, that you can hear that Ian Gillan's voice has aged with these later releases, but overall he still sings very well, and he gives a very solid performance. And we're not going to get Child in Time anymore, but he certainly explores some of the deeper, more soulful textures his voice presents on these later works. But that opening track is a wonderful sonic attack, which is reminiscent of this band at its very best. Gillan's lyrics are absolutely wonderful on this album. I must admit I really like the song Hip Boots with that bluesy Billy Gibbon-esque boogie. It's the foundations of which are provided beautifully by Roger Glover and Ian Pace, providing that wonderful platform for those other musical flights of fancy like the lead guitar and organ flourishes. All I Got Is You is a haunting number. The surprising is slightly reminiscent of earlier songs like Child in Time or When a Blind Man Cries. There's certainly some proggy aspects to that one. And Don Airey has been a wonderful replacement for John Lord. We still get that very throbbing Hammond sound. I'm glad I didn't say throbbing organ there. It would have been a little bit up Pompeii, although I'm sure Ian Gillan would have approved. But on a serious note, Don Airey's playing has all those neoclassical elements that very much defined John Lord's sound. Overall, it's a pretty eclectic mix in terms of its songs, from the bombast of One Night in Vegas, some of the darker textures and psychedelic tones in the wonderful Birds of Prey. It's a great album which I thoroughly enjoy, not as much as Now What, or even their last one, but nevertheless it's a thoroughly enjoyable listen. Number 15 is Abandon from 1998. This is quite a heavy offering from Deep Purple, with Ian Gillan in absolutely fine form, it has to be said. It's a quirky, intelligent album, a bit of a transitional record, with some nice blues inflections as well. And the real standout tracks on this one are Seventh Heaven, Fingers to the Bone, and Any Fool Know That. The band were constantly touring at this point. They were trying to kind of recapture a lot of what they'd lost during some pretty disastrous lineup choices of late that had seen Blackmore walking off stage fairly frequently, playing to much smaller audiences than they used to. It was about rebuilding. Perpendicular was a fine album, but I think this one just loses the thread a little bit. Instead of continuing where Perpendicular left off, it feels a little bit stale and bereft at times. But it's an album that kept the loyal fan base happy for a while, and quite rightly so. It's got some fine moments on it. Gillan is back in full screech mode. His voice sounds absolutely rejuvenated on this album, in my opinion. I think Glover and Pace are wonderful, and Steve Morse as well doesn't feel restrained in any way. But nevertheless, it's an album that sails a little bit too close to pastiche in some respects. Perhaps they were trying too hard to claw back that classic vibe rather than recreate a new one for themselves. As I've said, do check out the songs Seventh Heaven and Fingers to the Bone. They're absolutely fantastic. Also, Almost Human has a nice shuffle to it as well. Number 14 is the Book of Taliesin from 1969. This is the Mark I lineup once more creaking and straining at the cultural leash that was psychedelia. And the problem with these early records is Rod Evans' histrionic voice just doesn't sound powerful or full enough for the direction that Purple were heading in. The cover of Neil Diamond's Kentucky Woman on this one is interesting, especially so made by the very stabbing, abrasive keyboard style of John Lord. You know, it turns it from a little pop number into quite a rocking, psychedelic foray. However, it has to be said with this one and its predecessor, it was hardly the road less travelled. That heavy baroque organ-infused sound that was already well furrowed path by Vanilla Fudge, The Nice, and bands like that. I don't know if there was any kind of competition going on, but Vanilla Fudge would churn out Eleanor Rigby, and Deep Purple would say, hey, we can work it out. On this album, Exposition is a fine number with Richie Blackmore lead guitar parts beautifully punctuating those smooth vocals by Rod Evans. The Shield and Anthem have a nice psychedelic trippy vibe to them, but nevertheless this hard rock psychedelic excursion was beginning to sound a little bit tired by 1969. Interestingly, John Lord, the artist, not our John Lord of course, for this album cover was asked to evoke the spirit of Taliesin. Of course, the Book of Taliesin is a collection of 16th century poems. Number 13 is Shades of Deep Purple from 1968. Late 60s Purple for me is very much defined by those bouffant hairdos, frilly shirts and heavy stylised throb. This album was recorded over 3 days after the band had decided they wanted to be a 4-piece version of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and the cream all melded into one explosion of sound, with a smidgen of the nice thrown in for good measure. And The Address is a clear statement of intent here, one that they've resurrected for their new album. The fundamentals were definitely there, with that burgeoning heavy metal scene beginning to rear its ugly head. One critic has pointed out that Richie Blackmore was never so ill at ease as on this record. I'm not so sure about that, to be honest with you. I think it's one where the whole band are forming their own identities collectively and individually. And if they do come across as a bit tentative, it's fully understandable why. I have to say that John Lord steals the show on this album. The organ parts beautifully incorporating fragments of classical riffs, soaring above everything else in this morass of psychedelia, beautifully employing some motifs from popular culture as well. For example, Cream's I'm So Glad. It all endeavours to be one ornate frenzy of sound. Has to be said that Hush very much steals the show. It's that wonderful cover version of that Billy Joe Royal song. Mandrake Root is another real standout moment on this one. It's a classy, sonically driven amalgam of the Nice and the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Ian Gillan said that Deep Purple, by its very identity, is primarily an instrumental band, and you can certainly see the seeds of that beginning to flourish on this one. I admit that one of my favourite songs from this incarnation of Deep Purple, the Mark I lineup, is their wonderful reconfiguring of the Beatles' Help. Rod Evans' voice on that is absolutely incredible. It's a beautiful psychedelic interpretive dirge that really floats my boat. The singer Doogie White said Richie Blackmore's performance is an act of stillness, so that when he does do anything, it's dramatically amplified. And if you look at those early performances you can find them on YouTube, you can see that Blackmore persona starting to emerge even very early on. Number 12 is Who Do We Think We Are from 1973. With some very successful albums behind them, this lineup of Deep Purple had established themselves within the cultural idiom that was the hard rock sound of the 70s, and that burgeoning metal scene as well. And let's not forget Made in Japan had already gone platinum 2 or 3 times over by this juncture. You know, we get Richie Blackmore's guitar pyrotechnics and that familiar Hammond throb of John Lord, not to mention those banshee-like wails of Ian Gillan. But this one feels like a real disappointment. It's obviously evident that there was nothing left in the tank. They were running on fumes, so to speak. They were showing evident signs, compositionally and musically, of fatigue. I do feel that Deep Purple would have benefited a lot from having a figure like Peter Grant in their corner, instead of being pushed to constantly churn out and tour, rather than just taking a well-needed break. This band, as well as The Who, had already established themselves as a pretty punishing live act. Their sound was very British as far as I'm concerned. They lacked that transatlantic vibe that Led Zeppelin had. Also, this album is saved very much by Woman from Tokyo. Quality bit of riffing there from Ritchie Blackmore. What a wonderful, wonderful song this is that deserves to be up there with Highway Star and Strange Kind of Woman. And what a great album opener it is. It's just the whole thing tends to go a little bit off the boil after that. It's almost as if they were lacking any kind of motivational principle for this one. And it has to be said that some of the numbers on this album just resemble loose studio jams. We get tracks like Mary Long, which is a dig at Mary Whitehouse, of course, referred to by Ronnie Barker as Miss Hairy White Mouse, and of course loved by Roger Waters. That with the track Super Trooper could easily be termed as a filler, really. And the lyrics are fairly inane as well. I mean, Gillan's not really at his best on this. For those of us who felt the bar had been set very, very high by the Machine Head album, what a falling off was there. Number 11 is this one, Whoosh, from 2020. This is the third consecutive album with Bob Ezrin, I believe, but it's an album that's still very much bedding itself in with me. I'm going to put it here for now, but ask me in a year's time, maybe it'll be higher, or perhaps lower. Exquisite. I really enjoy these psychedelic textures in Power of the Moon, and the resurrection of that earlier number, And the Address. This onomatopoeically titled album, ironically, is all about an exploration of sound. The opener, Throw My Bones, is an absolutely wonderful number, with the band sounding very comfortable in their own shoes. This is a mature and ambitious album, and that's what's great about this band, is that with their later material, they've never stopped exploring and trying new things. Man Alive is a wonderful, moody number on this one. It's one of those songs that it beautifully explores different textures, reminiscent of When a Blind Man Cries, or even as far back as Hallelujah. On this album we get Gillan ruminating on the very transient nature of man's existence, and by implication, of course, the vastness of the universe. It's almost like a hard rock rendering of Edmund Burke's treatise on the sublime and the beautiful. I adore these spoken word interludes on this one. It's as if the band have gone all Moody Blues on us. Musically, this album is a delight to listen to. I love the raucous piano boogie of What the What. As I've said, the more psychedelic textures explored in Power of the Moon. And even what one critic has described as a whiff of the Gothic, with the number Step by Step. I'm pretty sure Edmund Burke would have approved of that one. I really enjoy this album, but I'm going to place it here just for now. Number 10 is Come Taste the Band from 1975. Ian Gillan was gone, Roger Glover was gone, even Ritchie Blackmore was gone. And this short-lived Mark IV lineup saw the inclusion of Tommy Bolin to fill what many would argue were perhaps the biggest shoes in classic rock. Nevertheless, this is a stunning debut for Tommy Bolin. It's a real shame we never got more of him. And as a testimony to the brilliance of this young guitarist, I read somewhere that Ian Pace and John Lord were thinking about throwing in the towel, but it was the absolute brilliance of his playing that made them feel like the band still had legs. Some of the standout tracks on this album, you get the grimy melodic dealer, you get songs like Lady Like You Keep Me Moving. These are all not bad numbers at all. I can't help but feel that when I listened to this album, it would have been better had they continued down to trek that very experimental path that they had embarked on with the Stormbringer album. Unfortunately, the Mark IV lineup was short-lived. They say when trouble comes, it comes not in single spies, but whole battalions. And not only did Tommy Bolin's drug problems rise to the fore, Glenn Hughes was often incapacitated as well and was causing real issues to the band. And Bolin's heavy drug use would reach its natural and tragic conclusion a year later. So I think as we listen to this album, we can only mourn at perhaps what might have been. The influence of Coverdale and Hughes is quite apparent on this one once Blackmore is out of the way, and the album takes a more soulful, funkier vibe. But it's interesting to hear the emergence of these voices that would have otherwise been subdued by Ritchie Blackmore's presence. Ritchie Blackmore had darted off to seek inspiration somewhere over the rainbow. Number 9 is this one, Now What, from 2013. The very title itself seems to ask where did the band go after the very tragic demise of Jon Lord? In fact, this album is dedicated to him, if I may read. Souls having touched are forever entwined. But this is one of the finest later Purple albums, I think, and I think Jon Lord would have been very, very proud of them. Don Airey is all over this one, and quite rightly so as well, as the band play with absolute gusto. This is no doubt a band reaching its dotage, and it's like they really wanted to prove something to if anything, to the legacy of Jon Lord. We get massive swirling soundscapes to the very tight riff-laden numbers that we'd expect. The opener, A Simple Song, is one of the best songs on the album. It's melodic and plaintive. We get some harder, more abrasive numbers on it as well, tracks like Weirdest Sun and Hell to Pay. As I said, Don Airey is absolutely fantastic on these ones. As well as the more eerie and cinematic, almost prog-like textures of a number like Vincent Price. It almost feels like prog metal with operatic shadings. What I enjoy about this album is it doesn't employ too much studio trickery and production affectations. The raison d'etre of this album is to very much keep the sound very pure and to make a very old school Purple album, which we've almost probably done very much live in the studio. And that ethos really bleeds through the overall sound and atmosphere of this album. One of the standout tracks for me is the rather ironic All the Time in the World, which seems rather sad considering the recent loss of Jon Lord, of course. I have to admit, this is a wonderful, wonderful album. If you don't know it, I really urge you to check it out. Number 8 is Stormbringer from 1974. Deep Purple looked to perhaps deviate a little bit from the sound established on the Burn album. Even some critics have pointed out that this one has some proggy aspects to it, especially in the Hemingway-esque Soldier of Fortune, not to mention the very gothic-sounding title track. It is an ambitious and experimental album, which is just one of the things I really love about this record. Pretty decent tracks as well, Highball Shooter, Lady Double Dealer. But overall, I think we'd have to say that the album is a little bit uneven. Ritchie Blackmore, of course, would leave Deep Purple after this one, voicing his objections to the specific album, and he would take those literary and gothic elements and have them reworked for a voice that's more suited for such musings with the first Rainbow album. I think with the Burn album, there was a concerted effort to prove that the departure of Ian Gillan and Roger Glover hadn't in any way harmed the Deep Purple product. But with this one, there seems to be a real drive in diversifying the Deep Purple sound. Hold On is a great, accessible, rocky number. Holy Man I'm not a big fan of, and we get the very Uriah Heep-like Gypsy as well. I think it's easy to see why this album often makes the upper echelons of people's top 10. Number 7 is Deep Purple from 1969. Some critics have described this record as the death rattle of a band in transition, and certainly it's the final thrashings of the Mark I lineup. Obviously before the much lauded Mark II lineup would rise phoenix-like from the ashes. But overall, this does feel like a little bit like a band in transition, especially as the freedoms and idealism of the whole psychedelic period starts to move towards the dark, foreboding autumn of Altamont and Watergate. Of course, in the UK, music starts to move more towards art rock and then eventually progressive rock. In the USA, there is this more of a drive for a more earthy, authentic, rootsy Americana, effectively rejecting the swirling vagaries of psychedelia. The band were at a crossroads, and what was required was a complete metamorphosis, which is exactly what happened. I think that's very much reflected in the overall feel of this record. Despite its detractors, it has moments of brilliance and beauty in equal measure. It contains a delightful blend of psychedelia and that burgeoning heavy metal scene. And this is in part driven by the contribution of Jon Lord, I think, whose classical pretensions were really sort of showing through at this point. And let's not forget Concerto for Band and Orchestra was just around the corner. But it's also defined by Blackmore's ever edgy, groundbreaking guitar work, and the result is this immutable rawness, energy, excitement, intensity, with a few proggy aspects to boot. A bit like Cream at the most incendiary, blended with the nice. There's some incredible virtuosity on display here. Tracks like The Painter, Why Didn't Rosemary, and especially Bird Has Flown. These tracks show ambition and are just at times absolutely spellbinding. I even like the Donovan cover. April is an intriguing number to listen to, as well as a 3-part suite, veering dangerously close to 5 British suite by the nice. In fact, Blackmore said that Blackmore often compared the very organ-heavy mix on this album to that very distinctive Keith Emerson sound. Number 6 is Perpendicular from 1996. Perpendicular is a real triumph for this band, especially this incarnation of the band. It's an adventurous album, and perhaps their most so in years. Steve Morse joins ex-Dixie Dregs Kansas fame, and he brings with him his own style. He doesn't try to just replicate those Ritchie Blackmore tonalities and flourishes. Sputnik Music says, Morse is nothing like Blackmore being rooted in jazz fusion, but this is exactly what this band needed at this time, something to shake things up a bit and help them move away from the pretty generic fare that they were churning out post Perfect Strangers. Sometimes I feel like Screaming is a remarkable number that really showcases Morse's abilities. Really beautiful, emotionally invested solo at the end. But also Gillan at this point still deserves to be considered one of the best voices in rock. The music on this album feels fresh, unshackled from all those preconceptions of the past, and it's very much given space to breathe. Its scope is expansive, cinematic, from the excellent flourishes that opened Ted the Mechanic, one of my favourites on this album, and a track that the band would churn out live for a few years after this album, to the finger-snapping Hey Cisco and Rosa's Cantina, not to mention the very acoustic and Celtic feel of The Aviator. I really love the spirit adventure embodied in this album. It's as if the band had been reborn, not afraid to explore different shades and nuances. I Touchway is an exquisite ballad, and Ted the Mechanic, as I've already said, is an interesting one, specifically because it explores a narrative of the extraordinary emanating from the ordinary. But the sublime Loosen My Strings would make my Deep Purple top 10 any day of the week. Number 5 is Perfect Strangers from 1984. Perfect Strangers was the perfect comeback album. As soon as we get that opening splurge of sound that introduces the title track, we immediately know we're in for something special. Deep Purple, of course, relaunched themselves upon a landscape that is indelibly marked by punk and new wave. And what we get with this album is this wonderful, sympathetic musing between classic Purple sound and emerging 80s hard rock sensibilities. Let's not forget the new wave of British heavy metal. The influence of that is still very prominent here. And it seems to me they didn't want to just produce an album that harkened back to the classic Purple sound. It's certainly mindful of that, but it's one that looks forward as well sonically. Never more so in some of the keyboard textures and nuances that John Lord employs for this one. This record perfectly represents the ferocious roar of a band firing on all cylinders. Knocking at Your Back Door is a great number. The way it starts with that stabbing intro by John Lord as well, borrowed, I believe, from the Jaws soundtrack. And this is combined with some pummeling work from Ian Paice and Ritchie Blackmore. But for me, it's the title track of this album. That's the best song on this album. It was introduced as the name of a football club, Perfect Street Rangers, by Ian Gillan at Nebworth. Nobody's Home is a great one on this. It's credited to all the band members. But Gillan's voice is specifically remarkable on this track. It's dynamic, it's nuanced from crooning to exploring some of those higher notes in his register. Also includes some wonderful musical jousting between Lord and Blackmore. There's no doubt about it, The Perfect Strangers has something of that high-gloss 80s production sheen to it. But it doesn't overshadow the music in any way. It doesn't. These affectations don't get in the way of the raw, passionate sound of this record. It's driving, it's dynamic, its quasi-heavy metal vibe is apparent from the get-go. As I've said, the title track is my favourite on this album. I particularly love some of the Eastern-style phrasings on this. In fact, Classic Rock Reviewers said, the rhythm is steady throughout, leaving Gillan the room to vocally paint the pictures of the rich scenery of the lyrics about reincarnation and passing through time. I love this album dearly, I really do. It was certainly enough to get me standing in a field in Hertfordshire in the pissing rain all day with, I think, about 100,000 other people. What a wonderful, wonderful record, and a wonderful comeback from this lineup of the band who hadn't done anything for about 10 years. Number 4 is Fireball from 1971, an album whose title track sounds like a hybrid of Led Zeppelin's Immigrant Song and Uriah Heep's Easy Living. This is such an intriguing record. I mean, true, they deviate from the blueprint that was laid down with it in rock. John Lord speaks very highly of this one. He says it wanders slightly and goes to places that the band wasn't expecting to go. He also says that without Fireball there could never have been Machine Head. I mean, there's no doubt the band broadened out and explored different sonic possibilities for this one. Tracks like No, No, No is a powerful, spiky number. excellent solo from Blackmore on that one. A Demon's Eye, a funky mid-paced number with a melody that really is quite infectious, bit of an earworm. And the title track is an explosively tight performance. It has something of a machine grinding to life vibe about it. It also contains Strange Kind of Woman, a track that's engraved on the skull of every hard rock fan, especially those gorgeous lines of romantic patter. She said her name was Nancy, her face was nothing fancy. It's a number that's definitely earned its place, like Smoke on the Water, in that classic rock Parthenon of rock history. Ian Paice, who is perhaps one of the most underrated rock drummers in my opinion, is absolutely immense on this album. I love the mule. It's a fusion of dark psychedelia and I have to say unnerving drumming. The live version on Made in Japan is absolutely immense, I have to say. And it's all brought to a close with Fools, one of my favourite numbers, which brings the album to a close with some intriguing progressive shades on that one. This is the sound of some incredibly talented musicians broadening out, and the writing is superb. Gillan's gone on to say that I thought from a writing point of view it was really the beginning of tremendous possibilities of expression. Number 3 is Burn from 1974. Interestingly, Gene Roddenberry said that time is the fire in which we all burn, and time spent with this particular record is definitely well worth it. And it's a record in which the band had a lot to prove, I think. Of course, Glover was fired, Ian Gillan had left, and they needed to forge a new identity, and subsequently the Mark III lineup rises from the ashes. Rather ironic given the album's title, I think. It's a record that takes a huge step forward in terms of its energy, from the very tired sounding Who Do We Think We Are. It was an album that was recorded in Montreux on the Rolling Stones mobile. And Purple's sound on this one starts to incorporate more blues and funk and soul textures, and they would continue to take steps in that direction, eventually prompting Blackmore to leave, citing that he no longer wanted to play this shoeshine music. As regards the title track, AllMusic believes that it actually challenges a seminal Highway Star for the honour of the best opener for any Deep Purple album. And this album opens up a whole new range of possibilities and sonic possibilities for this band, no doubt due to the inclusion of Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale, who share singing duties. It's like hard rock counterpoint, and let's face it, they've both got fine sets of pipes. Might Just Take Your Life is very much a John Lord signature tune, I think, and credit where credit's due. Richie Blackmore is all over this album. He's absolutely immense. Perhaps he felt this band had something to prove after the sacking of Glover and the leaving of Ian Gillan. Not that he had anything to do with that, of course. You Fool No One is an intense number, and Sail Away has a funky infusion aided by the wonderful rhythm section. But it has to be said, the standout moment on this album, apart from the title track of course, is what AllMusic describes as the slow boiling blues of Mistreated. What an epic and intense number this is. Hats off to David Coverdale, whose voice on this is just absolutely sublime, nuanced, intense, and profoundly moving. Bafflingly, it was a track described by Rolling Stone magazine as lengthy and flaccid. Number 2 is Machine Head from 1972. I mean, oh my god, what an album. An album that spawned a guitar riff that has been torturing guitar shop assistants for generations. This album is seen as a real return to form, although I must admit I don't really feel that's applicable here, because I don't feel that Fireball in any way dropped off in quality. It was Richie Blackmore that insisted that the band had kind of dropped a collective bollock on that one, which I thoroughly disagree with. But nevertheless, there was this drive to return back to the foundations laid in rock. I suppose, as the eminent philosopher Edmund Blackadder would say, needs must when the devil vomits into your kettle. So the band hunker down and try to recapture the summer of '69. And it certainly does that with the title track Highway Star, an album opener that for me is the quintessential Purple number. It's frenetic, it's powerful, it's intense, with some incredible music virtuosity and versatility on offer from all of the band members. And Gillan is just unearthly on this one. One of his finest performances. Maybe I'm a Leo slows things down a little bit, perhaps a breather from the intensity of the opening track. But there's also some remarkably melodic moments on this record as well. Of course, I'm alluding to Pictures of Home Never Before. The cherry on this particular cake is Space Trucking, and the version on Made in Japan is absolutely immense. all built around that powerful riff by Blackmore and Gillan's wonderful wordsmithery and his love for the double entendre. Almost feels like a merging of Ted Nugent and Charles Hawtrey. It's a track that provides a fitting conclusion to one of the best hard rock albums of all time. And the third, of course, in that holy trinity of heaviness that is the Mark II lineup of Deep Purple. Number 1 is Deep Purple in Rock from 1970. This is a punishing slab of vinyl, influential and incredibly heavy considering it was recorded in 1969. Many rock fans consider this to be their debut album, which I suppose is true if you want to dismiss the Vanilla Fudge years. All the ingredients, it seems, were in place for this most perfect of Perfect Purple albums. After the band's explorations in symphonic rock with the Concerto for Band and Orchestra recorded at the Albert Hall in '69, it didn't do so well. I think it only just about bothered the top 30. I think they felt that the band really needed a new direction. And subsequently we get this metal, classical, psychedelic fusion, effectively staking a claim as a prominent influence in the burgeoning metal scene. This album sets the blueprint of what hard rock albums should be. If Led Zeppelin's sound was drawn essentially from the blues, this band's influences were primarily neoclassical, melding with British pop and rock sensibilities, all unhealthily amped up to the max. And the production on this record is so brittle, threatening to shatter at any moment. Even the single from this time, not on the album it has to be said, employs that steroid-infused appropriation of the Ricky Nelson riff. The Blues Magoos had used it a few years earlier as well. And let's not forget the rhapsodic, tonsil-torturing Child in Time, a song that cements firmly Gillan's reputation as a vocalist. That progressive number with Gillan's purgatorial glass-worrying wails is something to behold. I just love the way it rises and falls in a series of hypnotising crescendos. Flight of the Rat is one of my favourite tracks on this album, a track that they've never performed live as far as I know, loosely inspired, I emphasise loosely, by Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee. And Into the Fire has something of purple haze to it. All classics on this classic rock in rock album, arguably the finest album they've ever done. Anyway, that concludes my Deep Purple worst to best ranking video. You've been watching a classic album review. If you have enjoyed this video, do be sure to click like, subscribe and check that bell so you get notified of anything else that I upload. And if you appreciate the work that goes into these reviews, be sure to check out some of the links below for ways you can support my efforts here at Classic Album Review. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much for watching. I hope you're all staying safe, staying warm, but more importantly, please do keep listening.